1,058 actions in 4 years, or 22 actions per month taken by President Trump's administration concerned immigration. According to the Immigration Policy Tracking Project, more than 50% of these actions pertain to humanitarian and non-immigrant visa categories. What was the impact of the actions and what comes next? Brian Blackford is an attorney with the Blackford law firm in Omaha, Nebraska, with expertise in humanitarian-based immigration, and Ryan Sevcik, our returning guest, is also an attorney with Koley Jessen law firm in Omaha, Nebraska, with expertise in employment-based immigration. Thank you both for being on the program.
Thank you for having us.
And I would like to start with you, Brian, and specifically with the asylum status. There are at least 60 actions taken on the asylum status within 4 years, and 36 of them issued only in 2020. Is there any other administration in the history of the United States to have been so involved and unsupportive of this status? What is the reason for this approach?
The short answer is no, and there's no other way to interpret this but as an attempt at the systematic undoing of our asylum system. However, it's important to back up a bit and to realize that there has not actually been any changes to the laws, the statutes themselves. So all of the Trump administration's actions or proposed actions were either policy changes or regulatory changes within those laws. So Congress, in other words, has not passed any new laws to actually shrink eligibility for asylum in the US. What it comes down to, though, are these attempts then to try to, again, dismantle the asylum system. Fortunately, most of them have been blocked by the courts, and so they have not gone into effect. But you do see several of them that have, and most notably maybe the Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers at our southern border, but also for applicants already here. We have seen the laws change. A very good example would be those fleeing domestic violence in their home countries. There has been interpretations of the existing laws that have essentially tried to eliminate asylum for these very vulnerable populations, primarily women. My approach to asylum has had to change as a result of these changes in how I advise my clients and how I prepare, especially cases in court and through the asylum office as some cases begin.
Now, Ryan, I would like to move to you to give us a summary of what has happened in the past 4 years, because non-employment, non-immigrant visas competes with humanitarian-based immigration when it comes to those regulations. 2020 was significant, and not only because of the COVID, but the proclamation that came as a result of it, or was justified as a result of it, but also there were 2 very important rules introduced at the end of 2020. Can you give us the latest update on this category?
Absolutely. And, it's similar to what Brian had just mentioned on the humanitarian side. Many of these changes that we saw, last year in particular, towards the end of the year and the waning months of the Trump administration, were regulatory based or executive order based. And now, unfortunately, one of those regulations was effective for a short period of time, was then blocked by a federal court. The other regulations that were put on the table and supposed to be becoming effective in the coming weeks and months here, those have all been stayed or at least postponed by the Biden administration. The H-1B wage increases that we had previously discussed, the change to the lottery process that we had discussed, those have all been kind of put on hold. From a regulatory perspective, we're basically at status quo to where we were even at this time, say, last year. Now, you mentioned, of course, the presidential proclamations and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would say from last year's perspective, the biggest changes in the impediments to companies that are looking to sponsor foreign nationals was that presidential proclamation that suspended the entry of individuals in H-1B status and a few other key employment-based categories.
The last update on the proclamation, is it still in effect? I know that there were some companies that won a few cases, but in general, what's the fate of the proclamation?
Correct. So the current suspension remains in place until the end of March. There was some debate whether the Biden administration would revisit that upon entry into office or in the first 100 days. So far, that hasn't happened, and that ban is still in effect. So we'll have to see in the coming weeks if that gets extended, if it gets modified, any changes to it. or it just expires on its terms by the end of March.
Brian, I would like to go back to you, to your category and your expertise, because we stress on asylum, but there is another status, and it's the refugee status that also has gone through a lot of changes in the past 4 years. We dropped to 15,000 during the last year of President Trump. Why it is important for the United States to have a bigger number, to allow a bigger number of refugees to enter the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is important that traditionally under both Democratic and Republican administrations, the average was 95,000 of refugee admissions. That is very drastic reduction from an average of 95 and to go down to 15, like you mentioned. That is huge. I mean, I think that makes a huge economic impact on our communities. I mean, we have an aging population in this country. We depend on immigrants, other people for Social Security benefits to be paid out. For many refugees, immigrants in general, are job creators. And I'm glad the Biden administration this year, it's going to be 62.5 is what he wants. And then I know, it's realistically made a goal of 125,000, but just this year alone, he's changed the fiscal year from 15,000 under Trump to 62.5 as the cap. So that's a huge increase, and that should really help America.
Do you think that can be related to the reputation that America wants to maintain among the world leaders, as well as a welcoming country, as a diverse country?
Absolutely. Our standing in the world has taken a hit under the Trump administration. We have become really closed and to the world, and this isolationism is not who we are. It's not who we should be. And I'm looking forward to that changing.
And Ryan, I would like to understand the impact of the rules and in general of the policy changes when it comes to employment-based immigration. The whole thing, it seemed to be starting in April 2017 with the executive order of Buy American, Hire American. How did that executive order impact the employment-based immigration? Did the demand drop for this kind of visa, or the demand remained the same, but the companies were hesitant to apply for that kind of visa?
From our experience in working with our clients, it was more so the latter. That enthusiasm remained high, and in some cases even increased. For all of maybe there were shortcomings of the past 4 years. Our country also experienced almost unprecedented economic growth, very high, low rates of unemployment. And so in our world, on the employment-based side, that drives a lot of factors for employers. One of those being that the availability of U.S. workers really dries up. And in that type of an economic setting, a lot of companies, turn to immigration and visa programs to try to source that work, from foreign areas. And our system is geared up to, for that to happen. That's exactly why we have it. And to Brian's point earlier, there were no legal regulation, or no statutory changes. It was more so than a policy nuance and changes on how closely they're going to look at certain things, or the way that they're interpreting regulations and statutes. So it did make, in many cases, filing of those petitions harder for employers to go through the process. It made it more uncertain. So that need didn't go away. It just became more costly for them to be able to find and source those workers.
Yes, and I would move now in 2020 when there were those two rules. It was just like a hurricane when those two interim rules were published. What happened to the enthusiasm of your clients? Were they impacted? How did they react to those rules? And what do they expect?
I think there was definitely a lot of concern with those two wage rules that came out, in the fourth quarter of 2020. As you and I discussed when we chatted previously, whenever I talk with clients about those, I said, they're very impactful. It could be very challenging to work through this, but let's put a pin in it for just a little bit, because rules of that nature have been successfully challenged in the federal court system prior to that. And then, of course, with the change of the administration, which at that point we were all, thought that could very well happen. It turns out that did happen. And so then now all those regulations that were proposed, they're at least shelved for right now. Had those regulations gone into effect, that would absolutely materially change the landscape. Gone would be the days where you can hire a foreign national, goes to a U.S. school, gets trained there, learns a lot from our educational system, and then wants to enter the U.S. workforce and be a productive member of our economy. Gone would have been those days, because now that person, the starting salary for that person would have gone from $60,000 to $90,000.
Okay.
And for most companies, that's just impossible.
Now, I would like to focus on what comes next. There are at least 600,000 pending asylum cases, about 60,000 asylees in Mexico, 945 in Guatemala. We have about 460 children in the U.S. still separated and without any contact with parents or family member. President Biden moved swiftly to end the Remain in Mexico program. But I would like to know your professional opinion of all those problems that we listed above. If you were to decide, what would be your priority to address right away?
I do think it's called the migrant protocol. Let's call it Remain in Mexico, as you said. That's a little bit easier to understand. So that luckily is starting. They're going to start allowing certain individuals who are housed right now. Well, housing is they're actually in squalor. Like the camps that they are staying in are worse than a lot of UN refugee camps, honestly. So I don't want to call them, I can't even call it housing, but nonetheless, they're going to allow the most vulnerable, those who've been waiting the longest, to come to the US to apply for asylum. I do welcome that. That is a good start. They will be under what's called alternatives to detention, usually ankle monitors or check-ins with immigration and customs enforcement to ensure that they arrive in court. And just, that concern, just to briefly touch on that some say that people don't show up to court. There's been studies about that, where that they have, especially if they have an attorney, that, I'm just, from my personal experience over the years, I can recall very few, if any, people that did not show up that I've represented to court.
There is a misconception about the stereotype of a person that is coming and seeking asylum in the United States. We all picture them as not as suitable for the United States. From your experience, can you give us a profile of a typical client of yours?
Yeah, I have a wide range where I represent a lot of domestic violence victims from Central America, largely women or children that have gone through horrendous, whether it be trafficking or just horrendous physical and sexual trauma and violence in their lives, that have come here and they grow up in systems where that's tolerated, if not encouraged. There's it's called machismo in the kind of the Central American Mexican cultural, but it's like that the men can control and basically have women as their possessions, and that's a cultural thing that the authorities do not protect against. Traditionally, that was a grounds for asylum. It's been kind of, there's been ebbs and flows to that legally, but under at least the Obama administration and even before that a bit, people were eligible, but now not so much. So we're hoping that goes back to the way it was. So I have a lot of clients like that, but I also represent a lot of clients that are applying for asylum for political reasons. For instance, somebody from South Sudan who was a politician who got kicked out of parliament because spoke up against human rights abuses, who came here, and we were able to assist him in filing for asylum. So there's really a wide range. I have political, so for political persecution to religious persecution to persecution for somebody's sexuality. I do a lot of that type of work as well. So it really is a wide range. And it's just, the laws have really, under the Trump administration, been squeezed on especially those fleeing the domestic violence and gang violence. And that, again, you cannot interpret it any way but to try to minimize those coming from Central America.
Ryan, I was reading somewhere that if we were continued to, if all those actions went into effect, actually there would be a reduction of 49% of immigration in total in the United States. And I wanted to talk about what comes next in the employment-based category. It does appear that there is need for some intervention. And I wanted to touch back to that wage. The quota hasn't changed since when it was introduced in 1990. The wage, it appears that hasn't changed either. Now, in your opinion, does the category need any revision at all?
Good question, and I think we're focusing on the H-1B there from the sounds of the question.
Yes.
So I would say number one on the quota and the limit. I think absolutely it's time to revisit that. As I mentioned before, the demand is there. You don't have employers that are spending money to try to pursue these visas if they don't need the workers, and so to not afford them the certainty of being able to do that when they have workers that clearly qualify, for the program. And the only reason they're not being able to get them is but for an artificial, limit on the number of visas that are available under that structure, can be very frustrating. And especially when that's based on a pure lottery system, complete luck of the draw. if you will, to get your new H-1B visa. So I do think it's worth revisiting that. In terms of the wage amounts, the methodology hasn't changed for several years in terms of how you calculate what that wage is, but the amount of the wages absolutely has. So the amount of the wages, that it's based on the Department of Labor's wage scale that is put out every year. At the end of June every year, it gets redone. And those are based on localized wage surveys. And the Department of Labor breaks that up by occupation and by geographical area. So for instance, in Omaha, Nebraska, if you're going to be a software developer, there'll be a level 1, 2, 3, and 4 wage for that occupation in the Omaha metro area. And depending on what that changes each year. And so if the wages go up in Omaha, then the wage that is required to pay for the H-1B program goes up. And where you land on that scale, that 1, 2, 3, or 4, is based on what the employer's requirements are for the position. The more experience they require, the more higher education they require, the higher you go up on that wage scale. So in my opinion, the methodology is sound. There's, with any system, there's ways that people can skirt it and try to abuse it, et cetera. But fundamentally, the minimum wage level does track what most private employers are paying for entry-level positions in those occupations. So I do think that the system is in place. I do think it's updated regularly. And so that amount of the wage changes with inflation, all those things are taken into account. What hasn't changed is the methodology. And again, I think there's room to debate whether that methodology should be updated or changed. But I don't necessarily think that piece of the system is broken.
You are for a higher quota based, and this is not just your opinion, but I bet it's based on your observation working with your clients and the demand on the ground level, right?
Absolutely. Again, I mean, most clients that we work with, they file for several cases in the lottery, hoping that they get a couple of them.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's the way that it's been. It's been a 30 to 40% selection rate.
Okay.
And they've got, great workers, qualified workers that have been, worked with them through the school, perhaps worked with them for a couple of years after graduating. And they ideally like to retain them. But unfortunately, sometimes you get to the end of the line where there's just not an option to do so.
Now, I would like to discuss about the news of this administration when it comes to immigration, the introduction of the U.S. Immigration Act that opens the path to citizenship to undocumented immigrants in the United States. Is the path to citizenship doable, in your opinion? And I would like to start with Brian.
I do think it would be, in my opinion, essential. I mean, going back, we've had enforcement after enforcement after enforcement as far as the actual changes in the laws. So it's always the stick, but never the carrot. The last time there was a carrot was 1985 under Ronald Reagan. Yeah. Ever since then, it's just been, again, more enforcement. It hasn't changed anything. In fact, it's made things worse. And so I think we have to have it, whether that means this particular bill, this comprehensive bill will pass, or whether they have to kind of break it down and make it more piecemeal for particular, groups of people. That is to be determined. There's Senate hurdles as far as, in our Congress too. I mean, so it's going to take bipartisan support. We have a couple of senators who, in the last bipartisan Senate bill in 2013, a couple of Republican senators now said they don't even support their own bill. So we'd have to get 10 Republican senators to join on or eliminate the Senate filibuster, and maintain all 50 Democratic senators to make it pass. So I guess that's to be seen, but yes. I'm hopeful, and obviously we'll do everything we can to advocate for it.
And I would like to go back to that bipartisan support, but first I would like to hear Ryan's opinion on is it doable? Is not just for what the President Biden promised, and he's just trying to keep the promise. In your opinion, is it doable?
I'd echo kind of Brian's comments on that. I think it's doable, but it will take bipartisan support, and it will take expenditure of a tremendous amount of political capital. If you remember, back in the initial years of the Obama administration, you had a similar situation where you had both houses and the presidency controlled by the same party. And there were a lot of promises made, and that at that time, the decision was made to focus that political capital on healthcare and the reform of that system. It's likely going to take a lot of political capital to get spent to make this happen. The fringes of both ends of the parties are extreme, right? I think we can all probably agree on that. So we're going to have to focus on that center piece. And so in order to do that, I think you will have to have pieces in there that are going to, that are going to entice both sides. I'm looking at the right side, trying to figure out some way of including in there some sort of security measure to try to ideally not land in the same spot again, where we've got, people who are entering the country unlawfully, and what that looks like, I think can take a lot of different forms. We saw what was tried to take place the last 4 years. That obviously is not helping. To Brian's point, it's kind of making it had potentially made matters worse. So I think there's lots of different ways that you could look at that, but I think you've got to have that piece of it kind of coupled with, how to handle the population that's already here, most of whom are productive members of our society. I mean, they're not here sitting around doing nothing. Most of those individuals are doing jobs. They're doing jobs that probably no one on this call is going to be doing. We also have to figure out a solution to those individuals who have been being sponsored by companies for the past several years, literally being here for decades, waiting in line, so to speak. And so trying to figure out a way to make that process, move quicker as well, so that it's kind of a fair and equitable treatment for kind of all groups of people that have been kind of caught up in this immigration mess for the last several years.
Is the system ready to take over this initiative? We're coming out of a pandemic. USCIS has slowed the work substantially. We have a backlog of over 1.2 million cases in immigration courts and only 520 judges. Are we creating more problems here? Are we throwing more problems? Will the system be able to respond to this responsibility?
I mean, I don't think we have a choice. I mean, this is where we are at. And, there definitely needs to be reforms. And I mean, simply throwing more judges at the solution, I mean, I think that may help, but we have to make sure they're the right types of judges. There's a bigger issue that I have with our immigration court system. It's not independent. This is a system that is under the Department of Justice and under the Attorney General, which is very politicized, as we found out, especially in the last 4 years. And this gets back to, really shrinking the eligibility for domestic violence victims for asylum. But the Attorney General single-handedly made that determination that essentially domestic violence victims aren't eligible for asylum like they traditionally were. That was completely political, and that should not be the way our system is. We need an independent immigration court system, at least, similar to what we have for like U.S. bankruptcy court. I mean, we should not have this to be so politicized, but we're here having independent judges that aren't just political hacks of the administration would be good. Under the Obama administration, the last second term of his anyway, there is priorities for enforcement. And that, while cases were technically pending, they were not taking up resources because they were just, the clients were allowed to stay in the United States, get work authorization, but they didn't have to physically go to court. And so that was undone, once again, by an Attorney General's decision. So if we get back to having our priorities for enforcement be to remove those that are truly dangerous to our national security, to our communities, that will help. And then also coupled with closing these cases for the single mom of 5 kids who just happened to get a traffic ticket 10 years ago. I mean, is that who we should really be focusing our resources on in this country? I don't think anybody would agree with that. That will help to reduce this, as far as the actual active case backlog in our immigration court system. And then, of course, with changes in laws, I think, would come more resources for USCIS, for the court system to be able to hire more personnel.
Yes.
There'll be funding for this. So I think that this is still something, that we should not shy away from. In fact, we need to embrace in order to fix the huge problem we are facing today.
Yeah, I would definitely defer to Brian's thoughts on the immigration court system. In my practice, I typically am not involved on the court side, so I've obviously heard the horror stories, and from individuals like Brian's, I definitely defer to him on those. USCIS, the processing times and the backlogs for that agency have skyrocketed, over the past 4 years, and even in the Obama administration years. So, either more resources are needed there, potentially driven by, modest fee increases. There's lots of different solutions for that. But I think that you're going to need more officers through that agency, especially if you're going to turn on the spigot, so to speak, of making, trying to have a broad-based program that applies to potentially millions of people. There's going to have to be more resources there. And again, the last year with the COVID-19 situation and staffing changes for that hasn't helped. Right.
Yes.
So I think it's just kind of the perfect storm, especially in the last year, of things that have just really bogged down the system.
Yeah. Well, let's hope for a good outcome with the U.S. The new act, the Immigration Act. And I would like to conclude our discussion with a question that is a concern. You hear a lot that one of the reactions why people are hesitant to support or even political support for this kind of bill is to set the precedent. Should that be a concern when we open the path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants in the United States?
I think the concern is largely, will this be a magnet for future unlawful, especially immigration. And I mean, I think traditionally, and even this act, so you have to be physically present in the U.S. before January 1st, 2021. So anybody that, if they announce this today or it passes in months from now, if people then use that to come to the United States, they're not going to be eligible. So that's one thing that I think needs to be clear, made sure that that's clear. And that's how it's been traditionally too. There's always been cutoff dates for, so even like going back to Reagan amnesty, you had to be here by 1982, even though it was 1985, I think, when that actual, legislation went into effect, you could apply under. So we're here. We can't shy away from it. We have to face it, and we have to fix it. We have to have, like Ryan said, the political capital, the political will, and that trickles down to the constituents of the politicians. We have to make sure that the voices of pro-immigrant voices are heard. We don't have a choice at this point. We have to deal with it, and there is mechanisms to do so. So let's do it.
Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And the only other thing I'd add is that, there is, I think you can probably get a broader base support for a bill like this. I mentioned before, if you can couple both addressing the problems that we have now that we're dealing with trying to figure out some way, some mechanism to hopefully avoid being back in the same spot 15 years down the road, whether that's border security, whether that's implementing programs to maybe remove the enticement to try to enter the country unlawfully, whether that's more efficient and effective refugee and asylum systems, et cetera, where people can actually use that process, when they need it, rather than feeling like there's no solution other than to enter the country illegally. So I think there's lots of ways that you can solve that problem. But I think in order to get this through, you're going to have both sides of the aisle come together. And I think the only way you're going to get both sides is if you have both pieces taken into account, addressing the problem that we have now and putting something in place to hopefully avoid having a repeat of this situation in 20 years.
Well, we don't want a temporary Band-Aid. We want a solution to this problem.
Legislation, Ryan, that spoke of, it contains some of that too, where they're going to be able to have a program where, especially in Central America, and they kind of had this a little bit under the Obama administration later on, where you can actually apply for asylum or refugee status in the home country, and then only if you're approved, you're allowed to come here. And also too, just making sure that there's resources sent to those countries to try to make sure that, the culture of domestic violence or gang violence, to try to combat those root causes of the unlawful immigration. So therefore, people wouldn't make that dangerous trip here if their own countries were able to, have some societal fixes. So I do think that's another part of this legislation, as I understand it. So that's something else to definitely monitor.
It is a challenge, but it's not impossible. If there is will, hopefully there will be a solution that will stand the test of time. And I would like to thank you both for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much.